Hello everyone and welcome to today's Connect and Learn webinar, Introduction to Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, Trauma Informed. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where we are presenting from today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I would like to pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend this respect to all First Nations peoples. My name is Phoebe Spry-Bailey and I'll be your facilitator today. I work at Workforce Development at Turning Point. I'm one of the trainers there. And so I'll be facilitating the webinar as part of the Connect and Learn series. The Connect and Learn webinar series is hosted by Turning Point and funded by the Department of Health. It's designed to support alcohol and other drug workers in Victoria in their practice. And also we welcome interstate viewers, because I believe we have quite a few of those with us today. So that's great that you're all here. Now, you've probably seen the brief video at the beginning, and I just wanted to do a quick reminder because we, like to make this webinar as interactive as possible, and we do love to answer your questions. So if you do have a question, please use the blue icon to ask a question. Our presenter, Jen, has provided lots of valuable resources for you today, so you can have a look at those in the download section. And also, we really value your feedback. So if you are staying on to the end of the session, that'd be great to get your feedback about today's session and also any ideas for future webinars. And if you do have to leave earlier, feel welcome to fill in the survey feedback when you leave. Okay, so there's been huge interest in today's topic, over 900 registrations. So it brings me much joy to introduce today's presenter, Jen Thompson. And you may recognise Jen from a previous webinar that she did a couple of months ago on trauma-informed care. So Jen has over 30 years experience of leadership in the not-for-profit sector and over 20 years in the alcohol, tobacco and other drug sector in both outpatient and residential rehabilitation services, in counselling, management and program director roles. She has a Master of Counselling in Human Services, Gestalt Psychotherapy and Advanced Certification in ACT and mindfulness-based therapies, including mindfulness-based relapse prevention. Jen has focused on building the therapeutic capacity of alcohol, tobacco and other drug services to be better able to respond to underlying issues relating to substance use, and has been an advocate for therapeutic counselling, co-design, client voice and empowerment through peer support and peer alcohol and other drug worker roles in alcohol and other drug services. Jen now works in private practice with a focus on mentoring, coaching and supervision of health professionals, managers and leaders. So now I'm going to hand over to Jen because I know that you're all here wanting to listen to her. So welcome, Jen, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks very much, Phoebe. Thanks for the introduction and welcome, and it's great to be back again to talk about another passionate framework of mine that we integrated in AOD counselling. So I too would like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any community members live with us today or watching the replay. And in the spirit of ACT, I would like to acknowledge and face our difficult history of colonisation and the impact this has had for community members, and acknowledge that I'm a visitor on someone else's land. So as we have said in the introduction, we're today looking at an introduction to acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, not ACT, and we're going to have a trauma-informed lens. So we'll also look at how to apply ACT to alcohol, tobacco and other drug concerns, and apply ACT to our own self-care. So before I begin looking at the ACT framework, I think it's really important to build a foundation for what works in therapy. And this is quite an old study now, but I really love the work of Scott Miller and his book, The Heart and Soul of Change, or also his book, The Heroic Client, that really reminds us that what works in therapy has a lot less to do with the method and a lot more to do with the relationship we have with the client, but also what the client brings. So if we ask ourselves, what are the mechanisms for transformation, we understand that healing is a process, and the potential for transformation really resides in the individual. And what accelerates that healing is creating a safe relationship. There's a mandate of empathy, and that we really have a radical engagement with the client to be client-directed in the process. And so what works in terms of facilitating ACT therapy in the AOD sector begins with being client-driven and having our own sense of presence with empathy and willing to engage with the client. So ACT is based in functional contextualism and relational frame theory. Its philosophy is about understanding behaviour in the context of what we see is only part of the whole person. So we have, for a long time in the AOD sector, had a biopsychosocial approach to substance use issues and comprehensive assessments. And this is really helpful if we're going to take an ACT approach, because we want to understand the context of behaviour. And just as Pavlov's dog salivated at the sound of the bell, we understand that there are a broad range of cues that people bring when we meet them for the first time that have a context in associations. So we want to understand the context of the individual, and we want to understand that the person, as they present, has a story to tell, and that story influences how we make sense of them. So if we don't take that contextual view, and if we don't understand, for example, that the person has a history of trauma, we will be at risk of blaming the client for all kinds of behaviours that we can't make sense of. So every behaviour is functional. In addition to this, the ACT approach does not pathologise. So psychiatry has given us a whole range of psychiatric categories with the disease model, and ACT, from an ACT perspective, we're called to really rethink this view of human suffering, and it would argue that we need to be much more holistic, and it would argue that every human psyche is intelligent and functional, and our job is to bring our curiosity and mindful presence to the moment to explore what's helpful and what's unhelpful. And I particularly like this approach that doesn't pathologise, that really understands human suffering as functional, and that all behaviour is communication and all behaviour is need-driven. So the other characteristic of ACT therapy is to understand that all humans suffer, and I guess it's in line with Scott Peck, if you've read The Road Less Travelled, who said life is difficult, and once we accept that, then it becomes a whole lot easier. So the ACT approach would say that in our life there is pain, but suffering is optional, and that as a service provider we are also experiencing pain, and there are at times a fine line between us and the client. Of course, we have privileges of education and status and employment, but there is a common humanity. There is an experience of suffering that we all live with, and particularly in this time of COVID, we're all having to experience the consequences of COVID, and of course the suffering is on a continuum. For those that are homeless, of course, their experience is different to ours. But there is an element of ACT therapy that has the willingness to disclose or discuss those things that we have in common, those things that are common to humanity. So ACT therapy would really put the spotlight on the internal world or the private world of human beings, and it draws attention and puts the spotlight on our inner critic, which is something we all have. So we know that the mind is not always our friend. We all have the not good enough story, and we understand that the not good enough story causes a great deal of suffering. So rather than seeing this not good enough story or self-loathing as pathology or defect, we understand that this is the mind doing its job. This is what the mind has been evolved to do, to protect us, to defend us, to help us to survive. And we also know that the mind is Teflon for positive and Velcro for negative. We all experience that. This is common to all human beings. We all have the thought as we come into a new arena, not knowing other people, will I fit in? Am I going to be rejected? So our brain is wired to help us survive, and we are social creatures. So we have this internal dialogue, and acceptance and commitment therapy would really explore the language we use, the perception we have of ourselves, and our sense of identity. When we introduced acceptance and commitment therapy in our program, we had our entire team trained in ACT therapy with Russ Harris and Louise Hayes, but we also integrated the Selfcompassion questionnaire as part of our assessment process, so Kristen Neff's work. And if you Google kristenneff.org, you'll see there's a Selfcompassion questionnaire that you can complete. It's really helpful to service providers to look at your relationship with yourself, but it's very helpful for our clients to explore their sense of quality of relationship with their self and to explore practicing self-compassion. What I really like about this is a very new infographic from Kristen Neff from her new published book, Fierce Self-Compassion, which helps our clients to understand that self-compassion is not just about tenderness and acceptance of ourselves, but it's also about fierce self-compassion that takes action, that protects, that is really willing to say yes and no in ways that are helpful, and willing to practice assertive communication. So this is really helpful in having a conversation with our clients around their quality of relationship to themselves and what their authentic self is all about, and how they might protect themselves in ways that are useful and not rigid or limiting. So as I've said, this presentation is a trauma-informed ACT approach, and when we introduced ACT at what was Knox Community Health then, we had a partnership with ICASA, and ICASA developed a program. It was a group program for clients with a history of sexual abuse that provided trauma-focused therapy, and that group was called TACT. Now, this wasn't published, but this was the facilitator's manual that we were all trained in, providing a group program that would look specifically at the history of trauma of sexual abuse and integrate the ACT approach in a group program. if you're interested in that, you probably would have to contact ICASA, so that's the Eastern CASA. It was a partnership with Eastern Health, so hopefully that material is still available. But if that's not available, you can contact me and I can talk to you more about that. So that is trauma-focused ACT. What I'd like to suggest here in terms of trauma-informed ACT is to really return back to the trauma-informed care principles, which we looked at the previous webinar, which is as a service provider, counsellor, if you're working in a detox or a rehab, really thinking about yourself, applying these principles to yourself. Am I mindful of creating emotional and psychological safety? Am I welcoming? Are there welcoming processes? Can we really offer trustworthiness and ensure our reliability and consistency and appropriate boundaries? Are we offering choice? Is there a collaborative relationship? Am I empowering the client? Am I aware of their cultural, historical and gender context and history? So these principles are really the foundation to have if we're going to have a trauma-informed ACT approach, to really remember these principles both in the system but also ourselves as individuals working with the client. The other factor of trauma-informed ACT therapy is remembering the vagus nerve, which again we looked at the last webinar, which is understanding that people are not just their cognitions and behaviours. We have what is a mind-body, one system of a brain stem and a brain, but also a brain around our heart and a brain around our gut, and the nervous system that interacts with every major organ, our digestive system, our lungs and our heart. So when we're working with people and we're talking about psychological flexibility, we're not just thinking about cognitions, we're thinking about the movement of the body, we're thinking about tracking the person and noticing, are they hyper-aroused or hypo-aroused, and helping them to work in response to their window of tolerance, so being very mindful of that. So as this slide was from the last presentation, trauma-informed care, as I said, a trauma-informed ACT approach would be really tracking how the person is responding in relation to their window of tolerance, and wherever there is dysregulation, we would be putting the brakes on and slowing down the process. So making sure that the interventions that we're using are matching the person's needs in terms of regulation and self-regulation. And the previous webinar, if you haven't seen it, was from Windana on sensory modulation, keeping sensory modulation in mind as an opportunity to support a client when they're really at their edges of their window of tolerance. So that's the backdrop, that's the foundation that we really need before we look at trauma-informed care. So this is the famous Hexaflex of acceptance and commitment therapy, and the aim of ACT is to develop greater psychological flexibility. Now, I've included in there mind-body, no hyphen, because what we know now from neuroscience, and if we take a trauma-informed approach, it's not just about cognitions and behaviour. We are looking for flexibility of movement as well as flexibility of the mind. So these are the principles: to be present to the moment, to open up and accept the things that we are avoiding, denying, disowning, that we watch our thinking and we have interventions that help us diffuse from our thinking that's unhelpful. So diffusion is an intervention. We look at ourselves as context rather than self as content. So really exploring, like a curious scientist, ourselves as context and understanding our feelings, thoughts, emotions, behaviours in a really specific way. And then we also, as a behavioural therapy, look at what committed action we need to take, and that action needs to be in line with our values. So what we really liked about this framework in the AOD work we were doing was we were having very different conversations with clients as we explored their values and what's important to them. And rather than focusing on problems, one of the first things we did in our counselling interventions was explore the person's values to really get to know what's important to them and how are their current behaviours in line or away from what's important to them, or taking them away from what's important to them. So that these are the 6 principles of ACT therapy. Now, Russ Harris simplified this, and this is a really nice way of presenting it to clients. Certainly we did present the Hexaflex to clients and explore the 6 principles with them, but another simple way of doing ACT therapy is to be present, be open and do what matters. And this includes all of the 6 principles of the Hexaflex. So we're going to be looking at that today in this webinar. Another psychoed conversation that we can have with clients around acceptance and commitment therapy is to introduce the 3 selves. Now, I call this becoming an embodied human, but in ACT therapy, Russ would say he's introducing the 3 selves. So we have our physical self, our body, which is a really important conversation to have with clients because so many of us live in our heads and think that we are directed by our thoughts, and to remember that from neck down we have, a body that needs to be taken care of, but it also has a lot of information for us. So noticing our physical self and also our observing self. So very similar to internal family systems, if any of you have had training in that. The observing self is the true self, or the capital S self, and really the seat of our being in which we observe all things. We observe our thoughts, we observe our feelings, we observe our actions. And so from this place, we know that we are not our thoughts and we are not our actions either. There is a part of us that can observe and notice and make choices. So ACT would say that when we are an embodied human, that we're noticing from our observing self and we're choosing our behaviours in line with our values, that we are going to be experiencing a lot more vitality. And that is the aim of ACT, psychological flexibility and greater vitality as a result of loosening our behaviour, thoughts and feelings. If we get stuck in our thinking self and the perceptions of self that are unhelpful, or behaviours that are unhelpful, and we struggle and ruminate with our thinking self, this is what leads to suffering. So, a mantra of ACT would be that pain is inevitable. It is part of human existence, that we experience sorrow as well as joy, but suffering is optional. And we focus on control as the problem, not the solution. So looking for the ways in which we try and control as a way of supporting ourselves, that then becomes very rigid, limiting and restrictive. So ACT has a very nice acronym for what leads to suffering, and what leads to suffering is fear. And the acronym stands for fusion with our thoughts, so ruminating, being fused with past memories or fused with particular fearful sensations. E stands for excessive expectations. So the other contributing factor to fear is that we set unreachable goals, or we have unrelenting standards. We're judging ourselves, and so this exacerbates our anxiety. A stands for avoidance, that as all human beings avoid pain and suffering and seek pleasure. We are pleasure-seeking beings. But this avoidance often restricts us and limits us, and it means that we are avoiding difficult experiences, emotions and fears that become undigested or unresolved in us, or pushed down, and then become problematic in terms of our behaviour. And the R stands for remoteness from values. So the other thing that drives fear and anxiety is forgetting what's important to us and getting caught up in avoiding pain at all costs and seeking whatever it is we need to do to feel better. So the antidote for fear is to have the courage to dare. And so this acronym stands for Diffusion, which is to observe our thoughts, to notice the mind is telling us certain things, or that we're taking on particular identifications or labels, and it's allowing difficult thoughts to just be there. And this is leading to the acceptance part of acceptance commitment therapy, accepting thoughts and feelings that are difficult, being fully present in the moment, allowing ourselves to observe our judgments and letting our emotions and thoughts come and go. The R stands for realistic expectations. So rather than unreasonable expectations, it's looking at what choices can we make? How can we make wise choices? What's manageable? What's workable? And this is really important when we're thinking about a trauma-informed lens, that sometimes it is about lowering the bar and looking at one step at a time and being kind to ourselves in the way in which we set goals and expectations for ourselves. And the E stands for embracing our values. So again, remembering what's important to us and is what I am doing in line with my values or what I believe is important. So they're really nice acronyms, fear and dare. And we had these put onto a little business card, a laminated business card. So on one side, fear with what that stood for, and on the other side, dare with what that stood for. And the clients found this a really helpful prompt for them to take away, but also to practice all of the interventions. So underneath every principle of ACT, there are thousands of interventions that the client can practice to build up their repertoire of being daring or moving towards their edges, expanding their window of tolerance. So we're going to look at the simplified version of the ACT principles, and starting with be present. So this principle would involve a whole range of mindfulness strategies. So helping the client to get centered and to know how to self-soothe, to regulate themselves in the moment, to staying present to the moment. It could be as simple as practicing noticing when they're brushing their teeth, the flavour of the toothpaste, the warmth of the water in the shower. So really encouraging the client to practice between sessions mindful observation, but also mindful observation of their thoughts and feelings, their sensations. And most importantly, we know that by being present, it can actually amplify the suffering for the clients initially. So it's very important that they practice kindness and self-compassion in this component of ACT therapy. I like John Kabat-Zinn's definition of mindfulness, which is to pay attention on purpose in and to this present moment without judgment. And that is the key, because as we become aware of the present moment and we start to really notice the labels that we have for ourselves, or the negative thinking or the self-loathing, it can be really quite triggering. So to amplify the importance of noticing without judgment and bringing kindness and compassion to ourselves is critical to this component of ACT. So if we just pay attention to this moment now and focus on our breath and notice our feet on the floor. I know it's very helpful for me as I say that, Phoebe. I'm just feeling the relaxation that comes as we pay attention to our whole self. So even now, as I say that, I notice that presenting, I've been very much in my cognitions, sharing this information with you. And right now, as I settle down into the seat of my being and feel the seat supporting me and notice my breath, I actually feel more present in this moment. So approaching this present moment and noticing what we see, noticing colours around us, shapes around us, and being fully present to the moment. So we know at this beautiful cartoon of mindful or mindful, why dogs are happier than humans, because they're able to be present to the moment, to the sunshine, to smelling what's around them and present to the moment. Whereas humans, when they walk the dog, are often in the realm of ruminations, worrying about what happened yesterday, what they've got to do tomorrow. So ACT would bring attention to this and would have a range of interventions, which we'll talk about, to help us defuse or unhook from these ruminations. When we bring this frame of mind to ourselves as service providers, so now taking the attention away from the intervention for the clients, but thinking about this in terms of ourselves, by being fully present, we're really able to hold the space for the client to bring whatever it is they bring to our conversation. So Russ Harris has said that one of the greatest gifts you can give another human being is to make them the centre of your full attention in an atmosphere of complete acceptance, openness and compassion, to really be fully present. And this helps us to track also how a client is responding to the interventions that we're offering them, and really tracking when they become dysregulated or when there's an intervention that we're trying on that may be triggering them in some way. So the next simple principle is to be open. So be open with curiosity, like a scientist, a curious scientist that hasn't seen what's around them before, to really bring a degree of beginner's mind. And it's also being open to accept what is, what it is that we're avoiding, whether that's difficult emotions, whether it's the grief that we're ignoring, or whether it's the discomfort of our partner leaving us because of our substance use issues, or that our children have been removed from us. Whatever is happening in our life, to really notice that and accept what is, but notice what it is that we are avoiding, and bringing awareness to uncomfortable emotions, uncomfortable thoughts and feelings, and notice what we are fused with, so that we can begin the work of diffusion or unhooking. So ACT would bring the spotlight on our internal dialogue or our internal monologue. So one of the interventions we might actually do with a client is to ask them to journal their internal world, and rather than keep our internal world as private, start to bring that more out into the open and expose. But also what's important in this intervention is for us to also share with the client, which, depending on your training, some of us have been trained not to disclose things, not to share things about ourselves, but ACT would say we want to share what's common to humanity. And what is common is that our mind has evolved to protect us from threat, from humiliation, but in that it can catastrophize. It can anticipate threat when threat is not there. It can have a not good enough story that actually limits us from oversharing or embarrassing ourselves. But when we bring these thoughts out into the open, we see that we all have the not good enough story. And once we know what the not good enough story is for our clients, we're better able to help them have some what we would call experiments to try loosening and unhooking from these unhelpful thoughts. So here we have an image. The monkey that says I am bad is completely fused with this internal thought, I am bad. Now, many of our clients and ourselves also experience this at times where we have a thought about ourselves that we're fused with, and we take it on as an identity. It's who we are. It's how we believe ourselves to be. So ACT would practice some diffusion techniques. And so our second monkey here is unhooking from the thought I am bad by saying, I'm having the thought that I am bad, or I notice I'm having the thought that I am bad. So already we're starting to create some distance, and we're also getting in touch with that observing self that notices the thoughts. And eventually with practice, as we practice diffusion, we will eventually become like our last monkey here, where thoughts become like white noise. It's like cars going by that we no longer pay attention to, or if we're living on a train line, over time we no longer hear the train. We are no longer paying attention to that and no longer driven by that. So Paul Gilbert has also done some fantastic work in mind training for shame, and this is really helpful for us to explore with our clients, that when they have a negative thought, that there are a whole lot of other complex feelings going on at the same time. And so really understanding what the mapping of their thoughts and feelings are can be very helpful. We know that this self-critical hating and self-loathing is one of the direct drivers of isolation, of drug use and of self-harm. So we want to explore the landscape of these behaviours and these thoughts and make the connections. Another great book by Sandra Bowden is a cartoon book of ACT therapy, I Just Want to Be Me. And there's some fantastic graphics in here that really expose the mind as something that gives us a lot of thoughts about our identity and perspectives of ourselves that keep us limited and small and feeling bad about ourselves. So the seagull in this story is the wise self that comes up with wise words of encouragement that thoughts are not necessarily the truth and thoughts aren't always important. They're certainly not commands or orders that we have to follow, and they aren't always wise. So that's a really helpful resource that our clients have enjoyed. The avoidance loop is something that we come back to time and time again with our clients when we're using acceptance and commitment therapy. So we work with the client to explore what's important to them, and then we explore what are the ways in which they avoid what's important to them. So substance use could be a way that they feel better for a while and then feel worse, and we also explore their triggers. The last simple principle is to do what matters. So here we have lots of very interesting conversations with our clients around what they value and what's important to them, and exploring that their values are like a lighthouse that prevents them from hitting the rocks on the shore, that the values can be like a compass that help them direct their life, but it's also a way of them getting out of their mind and into their living, and especially into their vitality. So ACT in a nutshell is really looking at what's important to you, keeping on track and moving in the direction of our values, doing things that are wise, making choices that are wise and in line with our values, but also noticing the detours that we all can make at different times to avoid difficult feelings. When we explore what's important to us, it can really help us differentiate what is meaningful and what is meaningless. And once we know what's important, it really helps us to get some direction. And so for some clients, it could be as simple as what's important to me is staying alive. So once we know that, then we explore what are all the ways that you can move towards staying alive, and what are the things that you do now that take you away. So ACT has lots and lots of metaphors. This is, its key interventions is to make use of metaphors, which are very, very helpful in conversations with our clients. One of the really helpful stories that we tell our clients is the story of being in the rain, taking our dog for a walk, and going to the park with our dog and coming home and being absolutely saturated on this very winter's day and realising that we don't have the keys in our pocket, and we're banging on the door to our flatmate or partner inside who is having a hot chocolate by the fire, watching a comedy and really enjoying the warmth of their home. But of course we're out drenched, banging on the door, and we can't be heard because of the volume of the movie. Eventually there's a quiet moment and our partner or flatmate sees us and opens the door, and we go in, and usually we have plenty to say about how long it took to be seen at the door. But what does the dog do? The dog does not ruminate. The dog shakes off, sits by the fire, and the situation of being locked out is far, far away, and they're in the present moment. But we could milk that story for 10 years or more. We can ruminate and hang on to that story. So this is, a really helpful way of clients really seeing how their mind ruminates and gets fused with particular experiences, has plenty to say that's either projecting negatively to the other person or saying negative things about ourselves. I'm very conscious of time now, so I'm going to move along. Some of the metaphors for thoughts is that our thoughts can be placed on leaves on a stream and let go. Our thoughts can be like a story that we are told. Our thoughts could be data. It could be really helpful data that we pay attention to and notice what's helpful or unhelpful. Thoughts can be like honey. They can be sticky. We can have magnetic thoughts that keep drawing us back. We can have thoughts that are like a soundtrack or a song that we keep playing. We can have thoughts that are that old chestnut. And, these are all metaphors that are really helpful for us to talk about thoughts with our clients around what's helpful or unhelpful. We can use the metaphor of the train, that a thought can come by and we can choose whether to get on or off. We've already talked about the traffic. Thoughts can be like traffic that we hear passing by, but over time no longer pay attention to. And of course we can have thoughts that are just like a soapbox that keep coming back to us. Another great metaphor is to think about who is the driver of our bus and in what direction are we going. Is the wise self the driver of the bus, or is the inner critic the driver of the bus? Are the thoughts taking us towards the way we want to go? We have a choice point in ACT therapy, so we need to notice between stimulus and response there's a space, and in that space is our power to choose, and in that power to choose is our freedom. So we look at the pros and cons, long-term, short-term of our behaviours, our thoughts, our feelings, and are they in line with our values? We consider, are we hooked or unhooked? What are the costs and payoffs? We look at urge surfing and creating an openness to discomfort, to sit with our cravings, to use some self-regulation and to support ourselves to stay with discomfort in order to move ourselves in the direction of our values. We could be in a tug of war, and what tug of war do we need to drop the rope on? The metaphor of the zip is very helpful for people who have difficulties in interpersonal relationships. Are we always open or always closed? Can we be gradually open and sometimes closed, and what helps us do that? So to wrap up, living bravely is about diffusion, acceptance, realistic expectations, and embracing our values. We need to sometimes go through the anxiety corridor and the learning circle to get to a place where we're really living our values in the here and now. And that might mean that we get out of our cocoon of safety and what's comfortable. This is just a note on a random control trial of ACT with shame and substance use concerns. You can look that up. And in summary, the ACT frame is all about connecting with our present, accepting what we avoid and is what we find just uncomfortable, practicing diffusion, exploring ourselves as context, committing to action that's in line with our values, and we apply all of this to ourselves as a service provider. Exploring ACT in self-care and in supervision is really helpful to see what we're fused with, whether we're practicing being in the present moment and whether we're in line with our own values. You will get an ACT case conceptualization template. This is really helpful to take to supervision, but also for yourself to make sense of your client and what's working for them, what's causing their suffering, and what could move them towards their vitality. So that's the workshop, ACT in a nutshell, trauma informed. I'm not sure whether we have time for questions. I think we might have just seconds left. Let's see. See what time we have. There's resources there for you to follow up.
Thank you so much, Jen. You've managed to squeeze lots of valuable information into a very short period of time. And before I saw your webinar, I knew minimal about ACT. So thank you so much. Yeah, it's been really interesting. And I love how, and really appreciate how you've given all the examples of how you can work with clients too, because that's always really useful. We have had a few questions. First of all, there was a question about, is this webinar being recorded? Yes, it is. All our webinars are recorded and they're available on the Turning Point website. So this webinar will be up there in probably about a week. And the other question was, people were asking, because there were so many slides, is it possible to get a copy of the slides? So I guess that's, yeah.
You can have a PDF of the slides.
Yep. Okay. So we can organise that to get them sent out from the registration list. And then, more importantly, we've had some really interesting questions. So Lorraine asks, how do we assist clients to move forward when they carry such a great deal of societal stigma in addiction, where many clients have been in trouble by our punitive laws due to their actions often feeding their addiction?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I guess, you know, it's looking at, well, what's within our control and what's outside of our control. But what we would definitely be focusing on is what's in the control for the client, is practicing self-compassion. And certainly that relationship they have with us, we would be ensuring that they know that they're welcome, they know that they're accepted, they know that there's no stigma here where we are. And we would be encouraging them to practice kindness towards themselves first and foremost. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question here. I've still got a bit of time here. Derek asks, ACT talks about the sufferings a lot on the mind and the struggles and controls over this thinking self and true self. And I wonder how about the evidence of working with clients with the pain that comes from physical pain, not the emotional pain. Is it the same way?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's I think there's 600 randomised control trials, and I know that some of those have been ACT and pain. So definitely, and also mindfulness-based stress reduction, as some of you may know, was originally working with pain. So we know that mindfulness and diffusion from pain, but also practicing mindful strategies can alleviate pain as well. So definitely can apply to pain. I personally haven't used it with physical pain as a practitioner, but I know that there's a lot of literature around to support that. So if you Googled that, I'm sure you'd find some literature and also some published books on that area of work.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Still got to, happy to answer some more questions? Yes.
I'm not sure how much time we've got, so let's keep going while we've got time.
So another question is, when emotion comes, how do we know if we are pushing too much? Is that
Pushing too much?
Pushing too much.
Pushing too much, yeah.
Sorry.
So this is where we're really looking for self-regulation and regulating the client. So putting the brakes on if someone is dysregulated in the room, if emotion is dysregulated, then it's time to put the brakes on and focus on the breath. So self-soothing, grounding exercises. We're not amplifying an emotion if someone's in hyper-aroused state or hypo-aroused state. So it's getting really good at reading those cues and having a good trauma-informed understanding of dysregulation. Yeah, hopefully I've answered that for you. Hard to answer very quickly.
Yes. Another question, which is what happens when a client doesn't know what their values or priorities are?
Yeah, look, clients really struggle initially with naming their values, but there are lots of tools to help us. So we have the Happiness Trap values, goals cards that Russ Harris has done, and also Signposts, which is from St. Luke's. We use these cards to help clients kind of map out which goals, which values are important to them, what's not important to them, and what's somewhat important to them. So they might need a little bit of help in exploring values and even understanding what values are, but there's lots of interventions that can help you explore values with a client. Oodles of interventions.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
And just to finish off with, there's just some comments which I want to share with you. So someone mentioned, I think we can, as a person, show we are not judging and being empathetic as a start to addressing stigma. So, yeah,
definitely.
And then another viewer today has, and this is particularly for you, Jen, thank you so much for this amazing presentation. I'm so pleased I registered.
Fantastic.
And then lots of thank you messages from others. So, yeah, I would like to thank you all for joining us today, but in particular, I want to thank Jen for joining us, sort of taking the time out of your, busy schedule and, sharing all this valuable information. And, it's just a little, I guess, teaser of how we could, start to incorporate it into our practice when we're working with our client group. So thank you so much.
And for those that don't feel they can use it with their clients, and I'd say there'd be very few that are in that boat, but for those that are service providers, apply it to yourself. I think with every intervention, we need to apply it to ourselves and think about how you could integrate it into your supervision. I think that would be a really good place to start and to familiarise yourself with the method as well. Thanks very much for having me.
That's okay. Yeah. So thank you to everyone. And, if you're still there, we'd love to have your feedback about this session. And if you've got any recommendations or some other topics you'd like to hear about, put those on the feedback form as well. So thanks a lot, and we will see you next time at our next Connect and Learn webinar.